I just came across this game today on my timeline between Magnus Carlsen and Arjun Erigaisi, and I was browsing Twitch earlier today, and I saw this final position between these two grandmasters, and I thought I just had to cover it because this checkmate here is such an incredible, it's such an incredibly rare thing to happen amongst like super grandmasters. At top levels, so many games are determined by a draw, and it's so incredibly rare to see a king checkmated like this. And to be clear, Magnus Carlsen's king, the world's number one player, his king is checkmated here in the middle of the board. That isn't something that you see every day, so I thought this was a worthwhile thing to cover here at the Norway chess tournament. So how in the world did this happen? I looked at a little bit of analysis from some of the top commentators, but I did want to walk through this game on my own here with the engine just to see what in the world happened here. So first of all, to be clear, this is a checkmate. The king has absolutely no squares to go to. The queen covers all the squares here. It covers this entire diagonal. The pawn covers the square on e6, and this other knight here covers the square on e4. And so the king is completely out of squares. It's in the middle of the board for some reason. Why is the king not where it's usually supposed to be in his castle? And this knight right here on d4 is just giving the it's just the final nail in the coffin of this position, giving the check to a king that's completely out of squares. So this game started out in what's known as a King's Indian style position, was what I saw from from a cursory look at the game. But let's walk all the way back to the beginning and figure out, how did Magnus Carlsen's king end up getting trapped in the middle of the board and getting checkmated here? Let's walk all the way back. So this one's Arjun Erigaisi is playing white. Carlsen is playing black. Carlsen's the number one in the world right now, and Erigaisi is a grandmaster from India. He's currently the world's fourth highest ranked player as of today. So this is a match. This is a game between two of the highest rated chess masters ever. And let's see how this game starts. We have d4, knight f6. A knight f6 is a move that goes into what's called an Indian position in chess. And there's many continuations after this knight f6 move. But the point of knight f6 really is to stop white from playing e5. You would like to control the center when you're playing chess. And when you play knight f6, you stop white from going into the center with this e4 move. Now if you play e4, black just takes. So here, white plays c4, controlling the d5 square, and black goes g6, getting ready to put the bishop on g7, fianchettoing the bishop and slicing down all of these dark squares here. A very typical setup by black here, and all of this is very well known. So far, all this has been played thousands of times over the board. Knight c3, putting the knight onto a good square. Bishop g7, following the plan, and just putting all the pieces onto squares where they belong. And here white goes e4, controlling the center, right? The point of going knight c3 here is partly to prepare e4. Now black can't take, because when black takes, white captures back with the knight. So that's part of the point of putting the knight on c3. And so black's losing a bit of the center here, but in this setup, it's actually okay, because black's plan is to fight for the center later down the line and use his pieces, which are hanging out right here on g7 and f6. Use his pieces to control the center at a distance, is the point of playing this setup from d6, letting out the bishop, bishop e2, putting the bishop onto a nice square here, preventing black's bishop from coming to f3, preventing the knight jump preventing the bishop from going to g4, preventing the knight from going to g4, and then knight d7 here, putting the knight onto a good square. Bishop e3, and bishop e3, very important here that black does not have knight g4. In many positions, black can go knight g4, hitting the dark square bishop, Black would like to take the Dark Square Bishop because in these kinds of positions, Black has a very strong Dark Square Bishop controlling this entire diagonal. And if Black is able to trade Knight for a Bishop in these King's Indian style positions, usually it's very good for Black. White pushes the pawn forward, striking the center. And here, White closes the center. He refuses to trade. He says, okay, we're going to keep the center closed, and we're going to lock it up. We're going to stop all the pieces. We're going to stop our pieces from being able to jump around the board freely, and we're going to play with pawns here. The point is, now I'm going to maybe play b4 and c5 here in this position. Trying to break through on the c file is one idea people could go for long term. Black jumps in, puts the knight onto c5. White plays the queen, and here Black pushes the a pawn down the board, grabbing a little bit of space and preventing White from playing b4. So a typical idea here, right, is White can often go b4 in these kinds of positions to kick the knight out and eventually play for something like c5, and after takes, White has a lot more space. You're controlling all these squares, and you're the king. You're ready to push down the board even further, and this is, you have the open b file, and everything here would be looking pretty good for White. I would definitely prefer to be playing White in this position and have the extra space, have the b file. So in order to prevent this b4 push, let's go all the way back. In order to prevent that b4 push, White goes a5 here, preventing b4. And White chooses to go knight f3, and in this position now, there's potentially knight g4 hitting the bishop. So Black indeed goes knight g4, hitting the bishop. And now White moves the bishop because he doesn't want to lose it to the knight. It would be terrible here if the knight was allowed to take the bishop, because after knight takes e3, pawn takes e3, you have a double pawn here. You have a double pawn here, and you have a pawn standing in front of each other, right? Remember, pawns like to be side by side and not standing one in front of another. That pawn at e3 is going to be weak forever. You have no dark square bishop to contest Black's dark square bishop, and it's just a very rough position. Don't let your opponents take the dark square bishop in this position. So bishop g5 here. And here, Black starts playing moves that I would consider to be kind of unusual, or moves that I don't typically run into every day on the chess.com ladder, or even like in real life, like over the board. I don't usually run into this f6 move often. And when I play chess, I'm typically very hesitant to play a move like this, because remember, these pawns here are supposed to be protecting your king, right? Once the king castles to the king side, the f, g, and h pawns are really supposed to be here. They're supposed to be on the 7th rank here and on the 2nd rank here, protecting the king. And so when Black pushes the f6 pawn, it's weakening the king, and it's a move that, to me and to many experienced chess players, would be at least like a little uncomfortable to look at. But of course, these guys are at the top of their game. They're some of the best players in the world. So when Magnus Carlsen and Arjun Erigaisi play moves like f6, oftentimes like they know what they're doing. They understand that they're weakening their king, but they're going for it anyway because they have like usually some kind of concrete reason to be playing moves like f6. But generally, like, you don't want to play moves like f6, weakening the king. So he pushes the bishop back here. Bishop slides back, and here Magnus pushes all his pawns forward, and so he's totally disregarding the safety of his king here. He's totally, at least to me, when I look at this game, I would generally not play so recklessly here, because I want to castle, and once I castle, I don't want my king to come under attack, right? When my king comes under attack, I have to waste turns like moving the king. I have to be careful of all kinds of tactics. But, when you're the world's #1 rated player, you could kind of do whatever you want, right? You could kind of break the rules here a little bit and just start marching of these pawns, which are supposed to be bodyguards, which are supposed to be protecting the king, you could start marching them down the board and, just kind of playing in like an edgy, like almost reckless way. Bishop slides back. We don't lose pieces for free. And Magnus here goes all out. He plays the pawn to f5, right? Really just throwing everything at Arjun Erigaisi here, pushing down the board, and he's potentially thinking about trading here. He's potentially thinking about castling and putting the rook onto the open file. And if the pawn takes on f5, that's all right, because after castling, right, the bishop and the rook, which will appear on f8, will both be staring down this f5 pawn. And Magnus should be able to win that pawn back in that position relatively easily. So Erigaisi chooses not to take. He goes back, adds some extra defense onto this pawn. So this pawn is now protected 3 times and attacked twice. And so that pawn's safer now. And maybe here Erigaisi would consider, or at least I would consider, taking bishop for knight here. And I would consider taking bishop for knight here because after pawn takes, as white, I'm happy to see black have these 2 doubled pawns here in the middle on the king side, right? I'm totally happy to see that. I'm happy to trade my light squared bishop because all of my pawns are on light squares. So I have the light squares controlled already. And my light squared bishop is less important in that position. You can see right here, my light squared bishop is almost basically blocked in by my own pawn. So if I'm able to make this trade happen, I will be pretty happy with that. So let's keep going. And let's go down all the way to this position, right, where we were. And here, right, Magnus chooses to push the pawn forward and attack the bishop. And worth noting here that the bishop here is totally trapped. It's out of squares. It can't go here. And so when your bishop's trapped like this, what you want is you want to have something concrete, and you want to be able to win something significant for this bishop, right? Because we're losing this bishop, guaranteed. The bishop has no good squares to go to. And so Erigaisi has to find something here. He would probably, I think, go here and kick the knight out, right? Or he'll probably go f3 or h3 here. When one of your pieces is under attack, what you can do is you can counter strike, right? You can move your pieces out, right? So you could, when your dark square bishop here, for example, is under attack, you could either run away, which you can't run away in this position. But in addition to running away, you also have the option always to counter strike, right? To make a threat to take something on your opponent's side that's worth the same as the knight, or that's worth the same as this bishop, or more, right? So Erigaisi here chooses to take one. So first you trade bishop for knight, bishop for bishop, and he pushes here, right? So he leaves the bishop hanging, and he chooses to counter strike in this position. And Magnus here, he can either take the bishop or he could run away and save his own bishop. And here he chooses to go back and renew the threat of this bishop, right? Pulling his own bishop back to safety and leaving the attack on white's dark square bishop open right here. And white chooses to put his dark square bishop back because he doesn't want to lose it for free. And here in this position, I think I still like white better. These pawn breaks, so the eventual push to h4 and potentially trading on this g5 square is interesting to me, opening up the open file for the rook. But black, Magnus Carlsen chooses to disregard that right now. He doesn't care about, or at least he chooses not to do anything about h4 in this position, and just strengthens his pawn chain here, making the connectory with the pawns, defending the a5 pawn. And Erigaisi also pushes that pawn forward, right, and makes this pawn triangle here in the middle of the board, and just makes sure all of his pawns are protected. Okay, here Magnus pushes in. It makes a lot of sense here. If you're playing white, do not take, right? One thing you don't want to do in chess is you want to try not to put your opponent's pieces onto good squares for no reason, right? His bishop here, Magnus's bishop here on d7 is, it's doing a lot for sure. It's controlling a lot of squares, but if you as white here take the pawn and let the bishop out, all of a sudden that bishop becomes a lot stronger than it was on d7, because the bishop would be controlling a lot of important squares around the white king. And for example, it would stop the movement of the queen and the king, and just make it a very unpleasant position for white to be in. Additionally, you have no white has no real way of kicking the bishop out once the bishop makes it to g4, for example. White can try to push, right, but then you're kind of weakening your own king, and in exchange for kicking the bishop out, you're paying like a very hefty price tag by weakening the king side right here. So you don't want to take this when you see a pawn push in like that. White chooses to castle, put his king to safety, and black moves his rook from h8 to g7. And so that move is also very surprising to me. Although perhaps it's less surprising now that Magnus has pushed all his pawns that would have been the bodyguards around his king down the board. So because he's kind of already committed his pawns down. So in the context of having pushed his pawns down the board like this, putting the rook on g8 it makes more sense within this context, right? Usually you want to castle and put the rook on f8. But in this position, if you're already committed to pushing your pawns that would have been the defenders of your king down the board, then going rook g8 makes like a little bit more sense here. Maybe Magnus wants to put his queen on e7 and perhaps also castle queenside, but anything could happen in this position. So let's keep going. Erigaisi moves his king up. He moves his king up. Oftentimes, like after you castle, you move the king to even like safer square, if that makes sense. So in this position, there's all kinds of like weak dark squares around black's king. You can see here if black somehow lands like a knight onto this square, right? It would be really bad for white actually, because this square on a3 is known as an outpost square, and if black ever lands a piece or a pawn even onto the square, it's staying there forever. It's never getting kicked out because white already moved the pawn from b2 to b3. And so any piece that lands on a3, for example, this knight, if it ever lands on a3, you don't have the option of kicking it out because that pawn no longer protects the a3 square. You already moved forward here with the pawn. So that's one of the reasons why you might go king b, or why as white, if you were playing white here, why you might want to go king b2, just to make sure this weak square is covered, and also really to protect the white pawn here on a2, right? You used to just have your knight protecting it and also the queen protecting it, but now you use your king to protect and also for your queen to do more important things. And also another side effect of moving the king to b2 is you let your rooks roam around the first rank, right? You unlock the movement of the rooks, so maybe the rook could potentially go here sometimes is an idea, right? And it just gives your rooks a little bit more breathing room. And also maybe you might swing your knights back around this way and reposition to a3 and maybe try to fight for the b5 square, right? If you could imagine knight b1, knight b3, and also knight b5. That's like a plan you could execute with your knights, just to lock down and put your knights onto this nice b5 square, and after the bishop takes, you would jump the other knight in, for example. And if in that position black tries to kick you out with c6, you would maybe play pawn takes, and generally you would be, I think as white, I would be pretty happy to get my knights onto b5, right? right? That's like one thing I'm seeing when I look at this position. And also there's this trade available, but generally, or at least in this position, you should really, I wouldn't be happy to do this as white, because the dark squared bishop is very important, because we put all our pieces or our pawns on light squares, and we really need our dark squared bishop to cover all of these weak squares. If we traded our dark squared bishop, we would have no defenders for any of the dark squares on our position. So generally, I would not want to make this trade. But okay, that's enough analysis of this position. Let's keep going and see what Magnus Carlsen decides to do. Magnus here decides to trade, which makes a lot of sense, because your rook is on the G file, right? Magnus's rook is on the G file, and when your rook is on a file, you want to open it up. You want to make a trade like this and open up the rook so it has actual good squares for it to go to, instead of being stuck here, being blocked behind all of their pawns. And so white here could either capture with the G pawn or capture with the knight. Erigaisi chooses to capture with the knight, so that puts a little bit of so when I look at the capture with the knight, what I see here is it stops the movement of the queen. Stops the movement of the queen down to this G5 square, stops the movement of the queen to H5, potentially sets up bishop H4 idea, putting the bishop onto a great square and just harassing the queen a little bit. But one downside of not capturing with the pawn is you leave this pawn kind of as a target. All right, this pawn right here is potentially under attack by the rook, and you have to, or Erigaisi, or if I were playing white, I would have to figure out how to defend it. I would be a little bit worried about that pawn if I were playing white in this position. Magnus chooses to go bishop f6 here, teaming up the queen, controlling the diagonal, right? Trying to perhaps get rid of the dark squared bishop here. Magnus has all of his pawns on the dark square, so getting rid of the dark square bishop is a logical thing to try to do. My dark squares are protected, and so I want to get rid of my dark square bishop because we don't need additional defense on our dark squares anymore. They're adequately protected, and I would like to get rid of the bishop, which is now like blocked in by his own pawns. If you can see here, the light squared bishop controls all of these squares, but the dark squared bishop is behind the pawns here. It's being blocked in by all of these dark squared pawns, so potentially going for a trade on h4, which you can't go for right now because h4 is protected twice, and moving the bishop here would just allow a capture. But that's one thing I would potentially be thinking about if I were playing black in this position. And also, of course, he opens up the attack on the g2 pawn, which white now has to do something about. So white chooses to use the rook to protect the g2 pawn, but in the process of protecting the g2 pawn, you weaken the h2 pawn, right? Whenever you commit resources to doing something in chess, you're also taking away resources that might have already been doing something that was useful somewhere else. So putting the rook here is the decision. Magnus goes here, he pins the knight, restricting the movement of the knight. Right, the rook is behind the knight, so knight can't move, because if the knight moves, you lose the rook. And Erigaisi here plays a3. And the point of a3, right, is Magnus Carlsen or black here potentially wants to start striking at the white castle here, right? This setup here with the pawns defending the king, we want to, or black, if he's attacking here, he really wants to start trading away all of these pawns and exposing the open files to the king. So one thing I might consider as black here is pushing down, right? Pushing down with a4 and trying to trade the pawns away, so I expose the rooks, expose the queen, and expose the white king to the threat of these heavy pieces on the black side that are going to be aiming at the king from like a distance, right? Remember, with the pawns in the way, the rook and the queen and all of these long-ranged pieces can't get to the king as easily. So in order to do that, you have to trade the pawns somehow, and one way to trade the pawns perhaps is like push down, and you could trade this way, or black could trade this way, or black could even potentially push all the way down and give a check on a3, and send the king back, and just put the white king in a very uncomfortable position, right? You can imagine if black's pawn went all the way to a3, it would give a check, and it would force the king back onto the first rank, where it will not have a lot of breathing room to walk around with. So in order to prevent this pawn push from doing too much damage, one thing white can do here actually is preemptively push, right? So when white pushes the a3 pawn, what he wants for black to do is he wants black to push the a pawn from a5 to a4, right? He wants this push because as soon as this push happens, white is going to counter push and push b4. And if you can think about a4, b4, once a4 and b4 happen, then the opportunity for a pawn trade is missed, right? Because the pawns can't go back once they've been moved forward. And after a4 and b4, you have like a locked structure like you see in the middle here, right? Nothing is going to happen in the middle of this board because there's no pawn trades available. These pawns are just, they're staring down each other, and they're not in a position to trade with any other pawns. And if the pawns aren't in a position to trade off with each other, then the open files aren't going to be available for your pieces to move around. And if the open files aren't available for your pieces to move around, then there's not really going to be an attack on the white king, right? So I know that's a complicated line of reasoning, but the point is to we want to lock the position down and prevent trades over here, because white does not want trades to happen here because that's where his king is. And any trades that happen here is just going to open the line of fire for black to come in and harass the white king. So that's why white might play a move like a3. That's why I would play a move like a3, for example, if I was worried about being attacked. And here, black goes queen d7, right? Adding some pressure here on the light squares, right? Maybe thinking about pushing down, right? Which doesn't work. But maybe thinking about also pushing this way, or pushing this way, or maybe just getting the queen onto the 7th rank and getting ready to castle queenside, right? The queen here on the 7th rank is able to swing around. It's got a lot of places it could go. It could team up with the rook here. It could swing over to f7, potentially join the bishop, right? Potentially add some more pressure onto this knight, which is only defended once right now. So queen f7, queen h5, right, would put pressure onto this newly weakened h2 pawn, and also add some pressure to this knight. This knight right now is only defended once by the pawn. So if we put 2 attackers on it, queen and the bishop, right, we would be able to potentially win a pawn here on f3. And also taking the knight, black would also potentially be able to win this h2 pawn here, which is undefended because we committed the rook to defend this h2 pawn. But let's keep going. Let's jump the knight in. White jumps the knight in here to b5, right? Which is a square actually that I mentioned a few moves ago as a place you could potentially put the knight on, right? Because the knight here hits the pawn here, keeping the queen tied down. Now if the queen tries to move, right? Now the queen goes here, well, the queen can't go here anymore because black needs their queen to protect the c7 square. We need this resource here to be protecting it. And if black pushes to try to kick the knight out, then we just take. And all of a sudden, this d6 pawn is going to be very weak. It's going to be undefended. Right now, it's defended by the c7 pawn, right? Whenever you push a pawn, or whenever you make any move, really, you're always strengthening a part of your position, but also weakening other parts of your position. Every move has trade-offs. There's very rarely a perfect move in chess that just is all upside and no downside. Okay, I mean that happens occasionally, but usually there's whenever you make a move, whenever you make an improvement, you make oftentimes a corresponding weakness in a different part of the position. So this knight here is really doing a pretty good job. I will be happy about the position of the knight, right? Hitting the c7 pawn, tying the queen down, preventing the queen from wandering too far off, pressuring potentially this backward d6 pawn. And now Magnus moves his king up. And moving the king onto the 7th rank is the analogy of white moving his king onto the 2nd rank. It opens up the 8th rank for the rooks to swing around. But it's also very committal because once you move the king in chess, you can't castle anymore. And when you can't castle, that means, well, your king is going to have to live in here in the center of the board. And, is your king really going to survive, like, sitting here in the center of the board, being exposed to the crossfire of all of White's pieces? Well, we'll see. I mean, we know this game ended in a checkmate for Magnus Carlsen, so we actually already know what the outcome here is. The outcome here is like, yeah, he gets punished for putting his king here into the middle of the board and not castling. But I want to figure out like exactly how that went down, how that happened, right? That's part of why I'm doing this analysis in the first place. Okay, Rook E1, defending this pawn here. This pawn here is backwards. It's not protected by any of its neighbors, unlike, for example, the D5 pawn is protected by both of its neighbors. That's a strong pawn. The D5 pawn is a strong pawn, but the E4 pawn is a backwards pawn. It's not protected by any of its neighbors, so it's feeling a little vulnerable, and we want to keep an eye out. We want to keep an eye on the pawn as White to make sure we don't accidentally lose it. Magnus going Rook G7. The point of Rook G7 is to make space for the other rook to swing around, doubling up rooks on the open file. Right, the only open file for black to really exploit in this position is the G file here. You can see all the other files have pawns in the way, right? There's a pawn here, 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 and here. And the only open file for black to access here is this G file. So that's where you want the rooks. And that's what Magnus is doing. Swinging the knight back, adding a defender to this pawn on E4. Although this knight move, in my opinion, if I were playing White, I would feel like I'm committing too many resources to the defense of this E4 pawn. Like, do we really need 3 pieces to be defending this pawn? Is there nothing more productive we could be doing in this position? I don't like having so many pieces focused on defending a backwards pawn, even though, it is a backwards pawn. I would prefer my pieces to be attacking and maybe doing some damage to black's position. But, number 4 player in the world, okay? So let's assume that he knows something here that maybe I'm overlooking. King F7, okay? And not sure why Magnus moves his king here. I would assume he wants to double his rook. So yeah, it's like totally unclear to me why he wants to go a king to F7. Is the king really better on F7 than it is on E7? That's not clear to me. Maybe he wants to make some space for the bishop. Maybe he wants to move the bishop back. I mean, who knows? But that move, right? Not every move in the game is going to make a lot of intuitive sense to me, although a lot of the moves do make sense. All right, Erigaisi, G3. He's trying to get rid of his weakness here, right? Because we had an issue here with these 2 pawns constantly coming under pressure. But here, after black chooses to take here, then I put my bishop onto G3, and my bishop defends the pawn, and the pawn defends the bishop. And, my pawns feel a lot more safer in that position than just standing next to each other without locking each other up like this in a defensive structure. And so here, Magnus, would I take here? I probably wouldn't take. I would really, as Magnus, I would really be inclined to let my opponent take. Right? I would really be inclined to let my opponent take, and actually, I'd be thrilled to see that move come down, because that would mean I get to recapture with this pawn, and all of a sudden it would open my dark sword bishop here, right? So as Magnus here, I want to let White take me. I don't want to take into White here, is what I'm thinking about, how I'm thinking about this pawn trade. He moves his bishop back, potentially getting out of the way for the queen to join in here, hitting this weak pawn on H2, which is undefended. This pawn is totally undefended now, right? It's a weak pawn. And if the queen sneaks in here, then Magnus might get to do some damage here on the 2nd rank. Also, you can imagine if Magnus picks off this pawn, then all of a sudden we would be hitting all of these big, heavy targets here on the 2nd rank. So, as Magnus, that's what I would be thinking about. And Erigaisi chooses to take. And I'm not sure why he chooses to do that, because all he's really doing, right, is opening up the bishop for Magnus Carlsen. Why would you want to open up your opponent's bishop like this? But Erigaisi, he's got a plan. He knows what to do here, and he actually defends with his bishop, which on chess.com, apparently this is a single exclamation mark. This is a great move in this position. Blocking the check and offering the trade. So even though this dark square bishop comes alive, white says, hey, I'm glad you have that bishop coming alive, but as soon as it comes alive, I'm just going to trade it off. I'm not going to let it become a long-term problem on my position. And here, black chooses to go down here, right? Threatening the weak pawn. And he's somehow not afraid of white taking the bishop here and just dragging the king further and further out into the open, right? Remember, the king belongs in his castle. He's supposed to be sitting at home, being protected by the bodyguards. You're not really supposed to be bringing your king out like this. But Magnus is fearless. He says, okay, I'm going to bring my king out and checkmate me if you think you've got what it takes. So Erigaisi says, okay, right, I want you to expose yourself and come out a little bit further. And Magnus's king here is just out in the open. It's vulnerable to this check. It's vulnerable to this rook potentially joining in. I mean, look at how strong the rook is here. The rook controls so many of the king's escape squares, and it could potentially team up with the queen over here on this diagonal. Erigaisi gives a check with the pawn, and here Magnus makes like a game-losing blunder. He takes with the king, and that's like a bridge too far, even for the world's number one rated player in the world. This king here is just simply too weak. There's too many checks that are happening. There's a check here. There's a loose pawn over here. There's potentially a check with the knight. This knight might swing back around. Too many things, too many threats happening in this position. Erigaisi jumps in, right, with the queen, and he's saying, okay, I'm going to try to hit him from the back here. I'm going to slide to g7 and skewer the king, and now we're totally in a king hunt. Erigaisi is saying to Magnus, hey, I'm coming for your king. I'm going to hunt him down here in the middle of the board and give a checkmate. Black swings the bishop back, trying to intercept, trying to block the movement of the rook, just to blunt the power of that rook a little bit. The rook is extremely powerful here on the g file. And white Erigaisi chooses to give this check. And this check is devastating, folks, because look at this. It's covering all the dark squares. The king can't go to any of these squares, right? It cannot go to any of these squares either. There's only one spot for the king to go to, which is f5. Every other square is taken. It can't be occupied by the black king. It's not safe for the black king to go on. So black has to go here, only move, and now white puts the nail into the coffin, swings the knight back here to give the checkmate, and oh my goodness, Magnus Carlsen checkmated in the middle of the board. That's beautiful from Erigaisi. We don't see this one very often. Beautiful game here played by Erigaisi, and a wonderful finish to Norway chess. See you guys on the next episode of Chess Norms, the up-and-coming YouTube channel where we give